Well, welcome everyone. My name is Walt Rogers. I'm the Deputy Director of TEF Iowa, Tax Education Foundation of Iowa, and really happy to introduce you to a couple of guys from Utah, the Utah Taxpayers Association. Rusty Cannon is the president, Utah Taxpayers Association, and Spencer Nintz, did I pronounce that right, Spencer? Is the research director of Utah Taxpayers Association. And TEF Iowa was really interested in Utah because you guys have been really on the forefront of the truth-in-taxation. And it's become an issue here in Iowa. We deal with taxes, most of our issues, and we hear from a lot of people who are concerned. And most of the time it's property taxes. Most of the time they're concerned, my property taxes are going up. And we all say, well, yep, we know. And so we want to take here in Iowa a look at what you guys have been doing in Utah because what we're hearing that has had some good effects. So if you guys could just start out, maybe Rusty, talk to us about what's happened in Utah, why you guys decided to invest heavily into the truth-in-taxation and what it really is.
Sure. So Truth-in-Taxation was actually passed back in 1985 in Utah. So it's been quite some time. And over that time, Utah at the time sat at about middle of the pack, around 34th or so in the nation as far as property tax burden amongst the states. And to illustrate how well it's worked, we're now somewhere in about the 45th, 46th in the U.S. So we've gotten even better and a lighter tax burden. And really the main purpose behind Truth-in-Taxation is that it doesn't place any limit on government entities raising taxes, but what it makes them do is do it out in the public, in the sunlight, and in a transparent process. They have to have a public notice sent to all property owners that's detailed and shows the exact amount of increase they will have on their parcel if this proposed increase passes. It gives them the time and date of the hearing to attend, to voice their opinion on it. And so it forces elected officials to make these decisions in the public eye with sunlight there. And so it has the effect of, as people show up to these hearings, quite upset oftentimes, and sometimes not, sometimes it's justified, to provide that check against elected officials that they just have to do it in public. And it has that effect of putting some effect of having them put a plan together, present it, and not just hammer taxpayers every year with automatic increases, which is what was happening previous to the law.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if Spencer want to go deeper into this. Like one of the issues is that in Iowa, these assessments take place and automatically your property taxes go up. So explain to us how that was a problem in Utah. And it being a revenue-based qualification, talk to us about how that changed everything.
Sure. So unlike traditional taxes, such as your income tax or your sales tax, which is generally a flat rate that you pay regardless of whether you purchase, for example, $1, it's going to be charged the same amount of sales tax as if you were to purchase a $30,000 car, right? With Truth-in-Taxation, it's very much like you mentioned, revenue-based. So as an entity, let's say a city, for example, collects $1 million in fiscal year 2020, they can only collect $1 million in property taxes in fiscal year 2021. And that's based on, like you mentioned, those assessments. As property values and assessments increase, the rate decreases to make sure that that entity receives the same amount, that $1 million in revenue. Obviously, there are some different calculations that factor into that, like new growth, any new buildings automatically get captured into that. But generally, it is a revenue-based system that really does protect not only taxpayers, but it also protects the governments and the municipalities and the school districts by making sure if property values do decrease, that those entities do not lose any of their purchasing power, any of that revenue as well. So it really has it's really a good balance.
Talk to me about how you instituted the direct notification process. I don't know, Rusty or Spencer, why that is so important.
Well, originally when it was passed in 1985, newspapers were more of a thing than they are now. but that's still in place to where that notification has to be done. But most importantly, there's a mailer sent to each property address with the details of here's what your property, here's the dollar amount your property taxes go up, the percentage they will go up. Here's when the public hearing is, the place, time, date, all that. They have to have the public hearing in the evening. They can't stick it in the middle of the day so people can't attend if they're at work. It's just that's been a very important part of the process. But it's really those two prongs. What Spencer mentioned, it being a revenue-based system, and what I was talking about, which is that transparency notification process. They still get to capture new growth, as Spencer mentioned. So if they build new homes, do new develops, that grows their tax base. But other than that, they get the same revenue as the previous year. And if they want to increase it, they trigger this notice and go through the hearing and notice process.
Tell me about, has this become a normal process in Utah? Have the taxpayers now expected it and gotten used to it and understand it?
I think there's a bit of a learning curve because property taxes can be a little bit complicated and, to be frank, sometimes a little bit boring. And so it's what we always try and do is educate not only elected officials but taxpayers as a whole onto how Utah's property tax system works and how it differs from everyone else. And so I think there's definitely that learning curve, but I think a lot of people are beginning to understand and realize just how valuable and important this system is. But what we do each year is we'll go through the top 50 cities by population, all the school districts and all counties in Utah, and go through and evaluate their budgets if they're going through or if they're proposing a tax increase that year. And we'll go through and meet with those elected officials and evaluate, and then determine whether we feel that increase is warranted. And if we feel it's not, then we'll go and get involved, and taxpayers usually are pretty engaged at that point.
Yeah. How many counties do you guys have in Utah?
We have 29 counties.
Oh, wow. We have 99 in Iowa. So when I thought about you just talked about, you guys kind of give an assessment of every county you go to, which is a great idea. I thought to myself, boy, if we did that, we'd be spending a lot of time doing it.
Yeah, we're fortunate to have some pretty large counties, and obviously our population base is pretty, we're a very urban state, kind of living in the Salt Lake City area, the majority of the population, so it makes it a little better.
Well, I was going to say one area of concern that a lot of citizens have, as far as misunderstanding goes, everybody has, and it's probably the same in Iowa, they might have a dozen line items on their property tax notice, right? School district, city, county, mosquito abatement, sewer, all these different things. And a lot of times they'll get this postcard that says your property taxes are going up by 15%. And they'll assume that means that their entire tax bill is going up by 15%, which is not correct. It's specific to the line item. Let's say it's the school district. Right, which is actually the majority. That's about 60% of most property tax bills in Utah. But actually, that's a bad example. Let's say it's the city. So the city sends it out and says it's going to go up 15%. And let's say their property tax bill is $2,500. They think it's going to go up 15% of $2,500, when in reality it's 15% of maybe $200. So it's still an increase, and it still needs to be looked at. But that's one area where a lot of times we'll even help cities, counties, and such explain to taxpayers that, hey, this is really what's going on. Please don't misunderstand. And there are times we don't just show up to every hearing and just say, no way. There are times every 5 to 8 years is what we tell taxing entities, to where you probably need to look at recapturing inflation. But where they go wrong is trying to, hit everybody every single year with just, increase after increase after increase with no justification, or, they wait too long and then they have this massive increase of 100% that just sends everybody through the roof.
Mm-hmm. That was one of our questions is, do you utilize a combination of the notices that will do county and school and everything together, or are they all separate notices when they inform people on the increases?
Yeah, it's one singular notice that lists all of the taxing entities and whether they're going to go through the process that year.
Okay, so they would get one of those notices a year, or how often?
Yeah, that's correct. They get the property tax notice once a year, and then entities can also obviously voluntarily provide additional information. And Rusty mentioned some of the transparency, like newspaper ads and these types of things. But the property tax notice itself is sent once a year.
Yeah, there's, for instance, we just were talking to a few different school districts that are going through truth and taxation hearings this year. And for example, 2 of them sent postcards on their own, where they sent them to taxpayers in their area saying, here's what's happening, to try to, in addition to the notice that's given, do it in maybe a more colorful or graphic or simple way to explain, here's what we're doing and here's why, just try to be upfront with taxpayers and explain what's going on. And they typically will do that when it's a smaller increase. They're hesitant to do that when it's a big one. And that's typically where people show up to the hearing with, pitchforks and hanging ropes, those kinds of things. But that gives you some idea of the level of involvement of everybody.
Well, when you say people show up to the hearings with pitchforks, I know you're kind of kidding, but
yes, we're kidding. Yes.
But it seems like you guys have created, obviously not just you, but the whole state has created a kind of a paradigm of expectation when it comes to tax increases. That just is interesting to me, because it feels like in Iowa, a lot of our taxpayers don't have anywhere to go. And we feel like it's just going to happen. Our taxes are going to go up. And just my question is, have you guys created this paradigm of expectation in Utah that you can't do that anymore? We're watching you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's elected officials that bemoan this system every year. Almost every year, we fight at the legislative session efforts to put automatic inflation into this, to where they just say, this is just too tough. We need automatic step up. That's only fair. And, or excuses like that, they bemoan it quite a bit. But we always try to remind them that just if those that were around in 08, 09, 07 to 09, this law saved your bacon, because your budget stayed steady while everything else was, falling through the floor. That as property values decrease and revenues decrease, that rate floats up to keep you whole in a bad economy. So you got to remember that you get both, right? You do have that transparency to raise, but you also get that floor where you get the same revenue as last year in tough times, and families don't get that, but the government does. So it's a pretty fair deal.
You guys have a state spending limitation? Statewide?
No, we do not. Any entity, and this is something that any entity really can do, they could raise their property tax rates by 1,000% if they theoretically wanted to, right? It's just, again, it's providing that transparency and that sunlight and explaining to taxpayers why, very unlikely, but why that 1,000% increase would be necessary. It's, again, looking at doing this and explaining it to the taxpayer and allowing the taxpayer to be involved in the process.
Something interesting that I thought Rusty said was there's people either at the Capitol or other that bemoan this. And so my question is, why do you guys think either county officials and state officials both, because I've seen them both, why do they resist this kind of stuff? Why do you think they can't resist spending money?
That's a very good question.
A big philosophical discussion here, but
Yeah, that's another big conversation. I think, we tell elected officials this, and they probably get tired of us repeating this, but just as someone who doesn't want to be seen in a swimsuit should avoid the beach, we think in Utah, you should not run for public office if you're not willing to make decisions out in the sunlight. And that's as simple as this law is. That there's, like Spencer said, there's no cap on what you want to do. It's just you are accountable for it. You do have to explain it, have that hearing and that notice, and then come election time again, your voters can decide what they want to do. But there's some that are good about it and really understand the system. But yeah, for some reason, and yeah, I don't know that philosophical question as to why some, especially county government or city government, seem to think that automatic increases are their birthright. And, that's just the way it needs to go. And we know families don't work that way. You can't earn income always with automatic increases every year and it's smooth sailing. Economies can be tough, and you've got to be fair to taxpayers.
Spencer, you got any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I would just echo what Rusty said. You know, it can be tough to make those decisions and to stand in front of your taxpayers when, you know, they're looking at their personal budgets and trying to figure out how they're going to make an increase work. That can be a very tough situation. But again, as an elected official, your job is to make those tough decisions. If it is necessary, if it is valid, then in some circumstances, we will come as a taxpayers association and, like Rusty has mentioned, explain and help educate people about why it may be necessary, you know, to kind of give a little bit of background and context to taxpayers. But, you know, you can't please everybody.
Yeah. I keep thinking about Rusty's swimsuit analogy on the beach, so you got to get rid of that.
Yeah, maybe not the best analogy, but
no, actually,
it works.
it's pretty good. It's a pretty good one. I always, you know, being in government and stuff, I always felt like the mentality was from everybody that government's got to fix the problem. We're the ones that got to fix it. So, you know, we got to have more money to fix the problem, when reality is a lot of times most of the problems don't need to be fixed by government. It could be handled in a free market way. So again, we could spend a whole other day talking about that idea.
Well, and that's the brilliance of the revenue-based system, right? Is it provides the necessary funding for governments to function without really ballooning into unnecessary ventures, right?
Yeah, exactly. Have you guys found legislative champions for this idea, and how do you continue to just keep them on board and utilize those people?
We have there's, you know, they come and go over time, but we have, for instance, our Senate president right now, President Stuart Adams in Utah, is a huge believer in this. And an organization that's really helped is ALEC. ALEC has made our Truth-in-Taxation law model policy, and that was used in the efforts that with Kansas and Nebraska that recently passed. That was sort of a coordinated effort there. So we get a lot of national airtime, examples like we're doing today, on how great this law is. And we have to go through, you know, painstaking effort to remind elected officials in Utah that everybody's watching, that this is a model policy, this is continuing to work, and push back against that constant drumbeat that they hear from local officials that, hey, you know, we need automatic inflation in this, let's weaken it. And there are efforts to chip away at it here at home, but we just have to continue to push back against that. I mean, if you look at it nationally, property tax is over 70% of local government revenue. But the problem is property tax hikes hit the lowest and middle income hardest. And, you know, that's why people get so upset. Typically, you know, your senior citizens and those on fixed incomes, or those that write that check all at once when their mortgage is paid off. It makes a difference when that goes up versus those where it's kind of baked into your mortgage payment.
Yep. And that's something that we should probably even highlight more, is that property taxes hit the lowest and middle income people hardest. So it's a big concern. We've noticed that Kansas did something recently similar to what you guys are doing out there in Utah. Can you talk about that, and talk about, along with Kansas, you know, what do you see that's happening around the country with this perspective?
Yeah, Spencer, you want me to answer that?
Yeah, if you could.
Yeah, okay. So Kansas, they passed a virtual carbon copy of Utah's law, a very strong public hearing notice that they put in, very detailed, the time and the place of the hearing and that kind of thing. Their campaign, when they went to pass it, they talked about the honesty gap, they called it. And we see this in Utah. In fact, we just called out some elected officials last week about this, to where they were doing in Kansas what sometimes those do here in Utah. And they say, well, we're holding the rate steady, so we're not raising your taxes, hoping that people forget or don't realize that, well, it's simple math. If you keep the rates the same and your house value goes up, you just got a tax hike. But they seem to say, oh, no, we're not raising your tax rate, which is not true. That's an absolute lie. You're raising their taxes by holding the rate steady. It should float down. And so that was also part of the Kansas law as well, that theirs will float down and have that same process. So they what we seem to see is almost a carbon copy of Utah's law. So we're pretty excited about Kansas.
Anything else nationally that you see some good things happening?
There's some other states that we are, well, for obvious reasons, your state as well as others that continue to look at it. You see a big battle in Texas in recent years where they, because Texas has no income tax, and so their property taxes are much higher, but they have the same issue, is where these local governments just hammer every year with increases, and people get sick of it and want to say, okay, we got to put some lid on this. We've also heard the same issues in Idaho, our neighbor to the north. Usually we hear from several states a year that asking for information about our law and wanting to do something about it.
Well, and not to mention, that's also a huge economic driver. We're seeing it here, especially along the West. California property taxes are, outrageous. And so there are a lot of folks that come here because of our lower tax burden. And we're seeing that impact pretty significantly here.
Yeah, because you guys are relatively close to California.
Oh yeah, California is the gift that keeps on giving as far as population, and that's not always a good thing right now. Our housing market is crazy, but yeah, it's Californians are moving to Utah. You see the same thing in the Midwest. You have Illinois folks fleeing Illinois to Indiana, and maybe you're experiencing it in your state as well. Migration from a high tax state.
Yeah. Talk to us about some of the roadblocks you guys encounter in the whole process of educating people on this and just implementation of it.
Well, some of the roadblocks, I think, are just the fact that this very much shifts the paradigm from a traditional tax. Like I mentioned earlier, the sales tax and the income tax are a flat rate, whereas the property tax rate here moves every single year based on property valuations. And so you kind of have to, explain it in a different mindset. But some of the roadblocks, as we've mentioned, is there's a constant push for automatic inflation, at a small percentage each year. And we constantly are battling against that, whether it's through the Truth-in-Taxation process or even at the legislative session. There's usually a bill of some kind that looks to undermine this Truth-in-Taxation process that has worked so well for Utah. And so those are some of the roadblocks that we definitely encounter each year. But again, we push back against it. We educate folks through different reports, through our monthly newsletter and articles that we publish, through press releases, all these kind of things to help people understand and have the tools they need to be engaged at the Truth-in-Taxation process or at the Truth-in-Taxation hearing, whether they feel that the entity looking to increase taxes is justified or not. And so it's really just using all of those different methods to give taxpayers the tools that they need to fight an increase if they feel they need to.
As Iowa considers this, and as organizations like ours continue to try to educate people on it, what recommendations do you have for us in this process of trying to get Iowa on board with Truth-in-Taxation?
I'll take a first stab at that. One thing that we found works or helps explain this process quite well, especially to local elected officials, is that this system protects your revenue in bad economies. And that's a phenomenal benefit. And it also places no cap on what you want to do as far as raising taxes. You just have to do it in public and provide notice. So it has both those facets to where it provides that stability as well as some protections for taxpayers. And so that really helps smooth over concerns with elected officials. And also you can work with elected officials to make sure that the notices are properly done, that they're clear and provide the right context to taxpayers, because we still see that once in a while, like I mentioned, where people misunderstand what it really means. It's not your whole tax bill going up, it's just this portion. And there are ways to tailor the language in legislation to make sure that notice is done as clear as possible, because as we all know, the government can do a great job at making things very hard to understand. And so those are a few things that definitely would help.
Yeah. So have you guys seen in this process, and we kind of talked a little bit about people coming to Utah, has it made Utah more competitive around the country as far as bringing people there and their whole understanding of their tax rates compared to everybody else?
I think it definitely has an economic impact. We in Utah have what we call the three-legged stool: sales, income, and property tax. And we always try to the point where we're almost a broken record about it, say a broad base and a low rate. right? And so we look at those impacts, and we're seeing, I mean, based on rankings, based on inward migration. I mean, Utah is really in a great spot and very, very competitive. There's still a lot of work to be done. Obviously, making sure that truth in taxation in this state stays strong and expanding it to the rest of the country. Lowering our income tax rate is also going to help. But we definitely look at Utah's tax system as one of the best in the nation, particularly on the property tax. And I think that has an impact on economic impact and bringing people into the state and providing more opportunities for families and individuals to provide for themselves.
To echo along Spencer's point, property tax, it matters to companies, to businesses, and every state's trying to attract businesses. And this can be one of the largest tax burdens of business, especially a heavy, capital intensive business could face, because it's not just their land and their buildings. It likely also is their equipment, their inventory, all that other stuff that, factors into property taxes. And so you can look at, a good low property tax burden as being very important for jobs in your state and bringing jobs to a state. And that's important for everybody. And that's another key thing to talk about. If you talk about lowering the property tax burden, it doesn't just stand there and starve local government. That's not the idea. But the idea is that you're going to keep it low enough to provide a low burden to attract jobs to your state. Utah has been a phenomenal recipient of that for decades, since 1985. And, if Iowa does something like that, then I think Iowa could look to have that benefit for decades to come if they passed a similar law.
Can you talk, if we're going to go down this road, hopefully in Iowa, talk to us about what's the most integral part of truth in taxation? What's the most important thing you need to establish?
The whole thing. No, I think really the transparency, I think, is the most important part. I mean, automatic inflationary adjustments are very, very concerning. I know that Iowa still has some portion of that in place. But I think doing it out in the sunlight and making sure that it's not automatic, I think, are the two most valuable things to property taxpayers as part of kind of this model legislation that Utah has.
And the second would just be that second prong that we mentioned, is that it's revenue based. Just because property values go up does not mean government deserves a windfall.
Right.
I mean, they get new growth under this system. So if they're growing and they need to provide more services, they get that new revenue. But just because, your home goes from a $400,000 value to $600,000 value doesn't mean the government deserves more money from you. They're not providing any more service to you. And so that revenue base is number one. And as Spencer mentioned, number two is the transparency.
And as I hear you, both of you speak, and we've kind of talked about this already, it just seems like Utah has gained an understanding of that paradigm. Like you just can't raise taxes willy-nilly anymore, and it seems like it's going to take a while for us to get there here in Iowa. But the process obviously is starting, and there's a lot of people very frustrated with where we're at right now. So I think that frustration is somewhat what can fuel us over the next few years to maybe get this passed. So
we hope to watch it happen from the seats in Utah.
Yeah. Again, any pieces of advice for us as an organization like this and legislators as we go into this?
I think it's just valuable to, again, show the comparison of Utah prior to this law passing and then after this law passing. Like we mentioned, our property tax burden now is seventh lowest in the nation at 0.56%. And Iowa is at 10th highest, according to Tax Foundation, at it's like at 1.5%, if I remember correctly. It's not right in front of me now, but I think that's going to be very valuable to show that Utah is doing the right thing while, again, maintaining essential government services and providing relief and transparency to taxpayers. And those are, I think, some of the calls that you should be rallying for.
Right. Rusty, any thoughts?
Just the last thing I'd say is, even with this law in place, property taxes in Utah have grown faster than population and inflation combined. So it has not starved government. It has provided the services needed, but at the same time lowered our burden over the several decades. It works. That's the beauty behind it is that it absolutely works, not only for taxing entities, but for taxpayers, most importantly.
Yeah. Sounds great. As people are watching this, again, tell us where you guys' website is so they can go learn some more information about that.
Sure, it's just utahtaxpayers.org. We actually just published a newsletter just this past week that's very property tax heavy, looking at truth in taxation hearings, examining burdens, and that would be a very valuable resource if anyone is interested in looking at that. Again, that's utahtaxpayers.org is our website.
Okay, well, Rusty, Spencer, thanks so much for educating us on this topic, and I hope some people will come and watch this and learn some stuff, and we'll probably have some questions along the way, and I just appreciate you guys giving some time today to help us in this process.
Well, we're so glad to do it. We really appreciate you inviting us.
All right, thanks so much.